Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Show with Bill Hull. The show about stuff most people try to avoid, but can't because it controls their lives. Religion, culture, and politics. Why does Bill Hull host this show? Because he and Bonhoeffer hoisted a few brews together in Berlin. Nope. That never happened. Is it that Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, both challenged and changed Bill as a young man? Well, yes, that is part of it. But it's primarily because Bonhoeffer called us to a costly discipleship, and there has never been a time when such courage has been more absent or desperately needed than now. Bonhoeffer famously said, "Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ." The Bonhoeffer Project is committed to turning leaders into disciple makers, because if leaders fail to create disciple-making movements, then we have failed. So, ladies and gentlemen, here he is. He's still tall and good-looking, and yes, he is wearing German cologne. He's acquired a few more underlying conditions, but direct from his underground bunker in Long Beach, California, the man who once told Don Henley, "You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave," Bill Hull.
Welcome again to the Bonhoeffer Show. I'm Bill Hull, and with me today are my two guest hosts, Dan Leitz and Cindy Perkins. By now, they probably don't need an introduction, but we'll tell you a bit more about them later. Today, we want to start with our namesake, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and the Bonhoeffer Project. Oftentimes, people will ask me, why did you call it the Bonhoeffer Project? I think because Bonhoeffer had his grand experiment between 1942 and 1945. Well, actually, it ended in 1943, but he had his grand experiment. It didn't last that long. It was an underground thing in the last part of it. But Bonhoeffer had 23 students at Finkenwalde, a confessing church seminary, which was an illegal seminary, which the Gestapo closed eventually. But he wrote his book, Life Together, if you've read that book, about that experience. Also, during that period, he lectured every morning on what would be called the book, The Cost of Discipleship, which impacted me very strongly as a young man. So for that reason, we honor him. And we want to start today talking about a subject to which he popularized this statement: justification of sin, not the sinner. And that is not good. It's what they did in the German church. We might call it Lutheran church. During the first part of the 20th century, it actually began long before that, some 100 years after Luther. But that really is what he's talking about. And so let's get into it. Most Christians don't knowingly begin their day by thinking of Reformation theology. Of course, unless you're John Piper, we give him a pass on that because that's what he thinks about. But revisiting the mind of Martin Luther through the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer can be illuminating and can actually change our thoughts and behavior. Take, for example, the Bonhoeffer statement regarding Luther's reasons for leaving the life of an Augustinian monk, because you might remember that that's what Luther was. Luther's reason, he quotes, for leaving the monastery was not justification of the sin, but justification of the sinner. And I think essentially what we want to say here is being saved is about a person being saved, not a doctrine of sin. And this is his point. Costly grace was given as a gift to Luther. It was grace because it was water onto thirsty land. Luther was a person who didn't think he could please God. He agonized over it. This was a real problem for him. The comfort for his anxiety, liberation from the servitude of self-chosen path, forgiveness of sins. The grace was costly. Now this is the italicized part. The grace was costly because it did not excuse one from works. Oh, this is the thing that so many people have corrupted about Martin Luther, is that somehow he wasn't talking about works at all, that he hated the book of James, that he said it was the epistle of straw and all that. But actually, Luther never did teach that a person is excused from good works. Instead, it endlessly sharpened the call to discipleship. So I want to say that one more time. This is what Bonhoeffer is saying about Luther. And I think Bonhoeffer knew more about Luther than you and I probably know about Luther. The grace was costly because it did not excuse one from works. Instead, it endlessly sharpened the call to discipleship. But just wherein it was costly, that was wherein it was grace. And where it was grace, that was where it was costly. That was the secret of the Reformation gospel, the secret of the justification of the sinner. So it's sort of like it's akin to what Dallas Willard said one time, that we're not saved because we're right. We're right because we're saved. Because you can't be right enough about doctrine. You can't be smart enough and get everything correct in order to be saved. If that were the case, then nobody would be saved at all. And we go on here. Bonhoeffer quite often spoke of justification of the sin rather than the sinner in its context of the early 20th century German evangelical free church, or even, I'm not free, but evangelical church Lutheran. It could be easily identified. Discipleship, as Bonhoeffer saw it, was daily following a living Christ who's active right now, today, and would reveal his plan to you for your life. This was no more evident than when he went to New York City the second time in 1939. He was there in order to protect himself at the behest of his friends and of Reinhold Niebuhr. He was there because he couldn't publish, he couldn't write, and he was going to be drafted in the army, and he wasn't going to serve in Hitler's army because he was working his way toward being a pacifist, even though he really never got there. But he believed that Christ was alive and active, and Christ is someone you could talk to and you could pray to, and he would answer you. And so that was what he meant by discipleship, is it a living Christ, a conversant Christ, a Christ who would hear your prayer and deliver and give you knowledge. So the growing pressure in Bonhoeffer's church was to do something about the Jews. An even larger issue was, would the church stand up and stand in the breach between the oppressive Nazi ideology and the Jews? Would they be independent of the state? Which is even the more fundamental question, to preach the gospel. Would they be disciples of Christ or disciples of the Third Reich? The answer to the question became the failure of the German church and ultimately the German people. They did not stand up to the government. They gave in to the prevailing cultural mood and opinion. They played it safe and thought they were right not to go to war with those who would make their lives harder. That's the easiest thing to do. Just wait. Hopefully they don't come for you. As long as it was the Jews and not them, they were safe. In protest, Bonhoeffer and many others formed their own church called the Confessing Church. Now, Bonhoeffer was a young man when the Confessing Church took place. He was in his 20s. And so he wasn't the leader of it. Karl Barth actually wrote the Barmen Declaration, which would have been the document that really set them apart and declared their independence from the state. The Confessing Church came into being. The Confessing Church, though, is if you were a clergy in the Confessing Church, as soon as you signed that document, here's what happened. You'd lose your pay, you'd lose your retirement, your medical insurance, or whatever else they would have. All the benefits were gone because that was only available to people in the German evangelical church, or what we would call today Lutheran. So at the base, the German church errors were two. The first, they had become progressive. And this goes back to the University of Berlin and its founding in the 1700s of Friedrich Schleiermacher and many other theologians. And they were the most liberal university and the most prestigious university in all of the continent of Europe at the time. They deconstructed both the Bible and the traditional interpretations of biblical text. There were professors that did not even posit a God or a personal God at the University of Berlin. They had left Martin Luther far behind and become the mistress of the Enlightenment, of rationalism, and the disciples of the critical theory. Now, the critical theory, you hear a lot about critical race theory or the critical theory today, but the critical theory has been around for a few hundred years. It was based on Hegel's dialectic that saw truth as an evolving entity. And think about it this way, that the idea is that you have a thesis, and then you have an antithesis, and then dialectic is the dialogue, and the debate goes back and forth, and you come up with C, which is synthesis. You got thesis, you have antithesis, and you have synthesis. And synthesis is that new, more refined truth, and you work your way up history's escalator, if you like, and we become more enlightened and more refined and so on. And of course, that came crashing down in the 20th century, the whole ideology, except now it lives again in America in a number of ways. Now, the second was their abhorrent application of the doctrine of justification by faith alone. They focused on justification by faith as a doctrine, part of a creed, then declared themselves forgiven based on agreement with that doctrine, and separated it from any behavioral result from it. Now, that's happened in America. That's part of the gospel Americana in many corridors or in schools and theologies and denominations. Therefore, they justified their continued sin against the Jews and their lack of obedience in daily life as covered by the great Reformation message, justification by faith. Justification by faith alone has to do with the sinner, not the sin. For the German church, it provided cover for the sinners to continue to sin. You know kind of how it goes. You live however you want, or with your bad habits or sins during the week. And then you go to church on Sunday and you say the creeds, you make your confession, you take communion, and you're good to go for another week. And in the church then used this doctrine to justify its sin. And their sins were little at first, subtle, benign, little sins, little lies, a bit of gossip here, a dash of avoiding need there. After all, it's not impacting our lives. It did impact their lives slowly as the Nazis dictated everything about the church. It even named their bishop, one Ludwig Müller, who was a crude and uncultured man who became the bishop of the church, appointed by Adolf Hitler. He was, I suppose somebody said it's like, Gomer Pyle becoming the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, you'd have to know Gomer Pyle. You probably don't. My apologies, but he was a buffoon character in a sitcom in the 1970s. So what happened is that it named not only their bishop, but the church then started displaying swastika banners in their churches next to crosses, sometimes over crosses. And the clergy, fully robed, would thrust their arms out in homage to the Führer. So the country went to war, 6 million Jews were exterminated, and in May of 1945, Germany lay in ruins. There was a time early in Hitler's administration the church had the power to resist. But when that window closed, they didn't, and we all know what happened. All right, so that's the history of justification of sin and not the sinner, and the damage it's done. And now we're going to take a break and hear from Steve Simmons, the man with the golden throat. And after that, we're going to come back, and Dan, Cindy, and I are going to discuss the 21st century American version of this sad result of the Gospel Americana, or how we have redone the same mistake the German church did. All right, so let's take a break.
We turn leaders into disciple makers. That's the mission of the Bonhoeffer Project. But before we can turn you into a disciple-making leader, we need you to be in a cohort. A cohort is a 1-year, 10-meeting, book reading, pray, wrestling, writing, planning challenge that has the potential to change you and thus redirect your life. Interested? Here's the process. Go to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com, and complete the application form. We will contact you. We will then help you select the type of cohort that's best for you. In person, online, or online school, which is asynchronous, so it's not affected by time zones and anyone in the world can access it. Oh, and training is now also available in Spanish. In the meantime, subscribe to the show, read one of Bill's books, and send us a question you want Bill or some member of the Bonhoeffer team to answer. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back. This German mistake has been repeated again and again, but nowhere more specifically or successfully than in the United States and the Anglophone countries, or English-speaking countries. We would describe it in theological slang as the separation of salvation into conversion and discipleship. What is meant is to be one thing, salvation, which includes both conversion and discipleship, into a subtle but deadly belief that makes conversion necessary, but discipleship optional. When something is considered optional, it's rarely done, and if done, it is done sporadically because life can go on without it. Now, I want to ask Dan Leitz, first of all, because he is a pastor and he's been involved in some of this controversy. And so, Dan, tell us about how this particular separation has influenced the gospel and how particularly it has kind of moved into your world.
That's a great question. You know, for me personally, I've seen it really crept in again as I went through the Bonhoeffer Project, as I now can say I'm an alumni of it. It's one of those kind of nuances about the gospel that I don't think until you're presented with the dilemma that you even really pay attention to. You just kind of assume, yeah, discipleship kind of happens. It's kind of it's a Holy Spirit deal. So you just kind of leave it at that. I really came face to face with it, to be honest with you, through the Bonhoeffer Project, but then in my own studies as I was teaching through the book of Luke. And coincidentally, it was correlating through a time in my own pastoral journey with some other pastors who are part of what's known as the free grace movement, which is basically just say a prayer and believe, and that's all you need. And my own angsty unsettledness with this idea that all you got to do is pray a prayer and then you're good. And wrestling through that, I believe it really came across as I studied through the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, looking specifically at Peter and Judas. How Peter, when he was faced with just the betrayal of Jesus, he repented, he wept bitterly, probably saw Jesus hanging on the cross and just, it was brutal for him, but he repented. And Judas, who had the same upbringing, if you will, biblically, walked with Jesus for the same amount of time that Peter did, followed him, heard the sermons, heard the teachings, even obeyed to a certain extent because he went through the motions with all the other guys. But he betrayed the Son of Man for 30 pieces of silver. That in and of itself showed me there was a difference, that you can be part of the group, you can be in the club, you can even say all the right things, but if the heart's not there, if there has not been a conversion of the mind, you can have quote unquote belief, but if it has not caused a change of heart, is it worth anything at all? In my opinion, it's become worthless. If the salt loses its savoriness, it's not even good for the dung heap. It's not even good enough to spread on manure. And so we've got to make sure that that's salt and light. Again, as you referred to the book of James, faith without works is dead. I'll show you my faith by my works.
Okay. What do you think of the process? How widespread is the free grace? You call it the free grace movement?
Free grace theology, yeah, free grace movement.
How widespread is that, and how big of a problem do you think it is?
Well, I think that's a twofold answer. I think it's creeping up in its popularity because it's super simple, and people think, well, the gospel is simple. It's grace, and take a couple of scriptures and only take half of them or half the context, and don't compare that with the rest of scripture, and it becomes very easy. I think the worst part, I think where it's scariest, is because it is promulgated within churches unknowingly. It's not that it's defined as free grace theology, but it's defined as, and this is a subtle difference, give your life to Jesus instead of, like the new phraseology is accept Jesus in your heart, accept something that he has given you, versus what it used to be said in late 50s and 60s, surrender your life. It used to be called surrender. Now it's accept. One is to do with me, and one is to do with Jesus. I'm going to surrender to him. The other one is I'll accept your version in my life. So I see it's the scariest in the fact that it's not understood that it's actually being proposed in many pulpits today.
Yeah, like for example, to accept, to see agreement as faith.
Right.
And it isn't the same thing. Cindy, I'm going to, I want to say a couple things here and then ask you a question. Larry Alex Taunton, who is the CEO of, I think it's called Fixed Point Foundation, he says most of the evil committed in the world is of a subtle nature. It's committed by the Kempkas. Now, Kempka was it's the last name of Adolf Hitler's personal driver. And he talks, and Kempe has a book he wrote about Hitler. And essentially it says, that he was a great guy. He was kind to animals. He had people that were close to him, loved him, all these kinds of things. He never mentioned anything in the book about the Holocaust or about the war or about any of those kinds of things. It was kind of an unrealistic book, but he says it's committed by the Kempkas, that is the many people who aren't the architects of evil. They are just indifferent to it unless it affects them at a personal level. Who are, I wonder, the army of people who don't actually kill babies. They just make abortion clinics run efficiently. What of the myriad bureaucrats who daily obstruct, ignore, or inflict hardship on the people they are meant to serve? This is evil, subtle, but evil nonetheless. How many of us who have never intentionally done anything, any harm, turn a blind eye to the poor, the sick, the elderly, those whom Jesus called the least of these? How many of us ignore the larger narrative of evil? The persecution of our Christian brothers and sisters, the wicked curriculums being taught to our children in our public schools, and the systematic suppression of dissenting voices, but are quick to note a slight. I guess what I'm going to ask you, Cindy, is how does the gospel, that this idea of the justification of our sin rather than the sinner, and what we've been talking about, the free grace movement, or what we call the forgiveness only gospel, how that relates to the subtleness of sin and what's going on down deeper in our souls?
Well, I think that's a really good question, but I think it has to do with how we see sin, right? So I think back to the early church and Ananias and Sapphira. They came in and they wanted, Satan had filled them up with a desire to be seen in a good light by the church. And so they didn't even see their sin as sin. And I was studying in Acts, we're actually walking through that with our women's ministry. And I ran across a quote by Agus Johnson. And he says, when we fear the holiness of God and the consequences of sin, we avoid sin. But we do not turn from sin into a vacuum. We embrace life to the full. And he was talking about community and about how we engage in community. And I think it rolls back to leadership, Bill. In our churches, all too often, we as leaders have been reluctant to call out sin. We don't want to call it that because people might leave. They might cancel us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to learn again to fear the holiness of God and understand that. Dietrich Bonhoeffer understood that. He understood the holiness of God and how the sin that besets us. It's the sin that is in the old man. And until we learn to walk in the new creation, it has a subtle hold on us. So we don't even see that. And like Dan said, sometimes we don't even know these things until it's pointed out to us. But then we have to do something with that, right? Once I'm made aware of the sin in my life, I have to do something with it. And that then comes back to the place of is what you're doing bringing glory to God? Because if it's not, it's likely sin.
Yeah, Bonhoeffer had a great statement in his book, Life Together. He said, your sin wants to be alone with you.
Yeah.
And what he's talking about, of course, is when you close yourself off and you say, Jesus and I'll handle this sin by ourselves and we're not going to tell anybody else, then he's got you right, the enemy has you right where he wants you. Because then he doesn't have to compete with other people who would give you godly advice, good advice. And so that's the reason that I think we need to have, as you've said, and you've made the case in a number of our programs, Cindy, the power of relationships. Because, the way you test our love is tested in relationship.
And one of the things too that I want to make mention, and when you're dealing with sin specifically, you have to replace the sin with righteousness. You can't just think that you've dealt with it and then it's gone, because sin's always going to find another outlet. You have to replace that sin in your life with new righteousness, whether it's prayer time or fellowship or relationship or community. Because if not, your flesh is super creative. The enemy's super demanding in his attention desires, and you're going to find another way and another outlet to sin.
Well, and in America, we're just plain lazy.
Yep.
We're just lazy. And laziness leads to fearfulness, which then leads to inactivity and depression. And we sit in our junk and we can't figure out how to get out of our junk, when in fact, if we would just look our sin in the eye and say, no more. No more, because God says, be holy as I am holy. And we've got a responsibility to move toward that. But we don't, in too many churches, and I've been in a lot of churches in my life, and never have I been taught a strong doctrine of holiness, right? And that's the piece. When I landed upon Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Dallas Willard and Bill Hull, that's when my life began to change, because I'm like, wait a minute, this is not just easy believism. This is not the easy grace movement. There is something required of me in order to live in a relationship with a holy God. Because if scripture says he can't look on sin and my life is filled with sin, what does that mean for my relationship? And so I began to actively put away sin in my life. Didn't achieve perfection, won't on this side of heaven, right? Let's be clear about that. but that doesn't mean that I stop moving in that direction.
You know, I was thinking about this idea of disassociation, and disassociation is something where people say they claim their innocence, and they'll do something like this. It's sort of the new church startup called the woke church, which talks like this and teaches this as part of their theology. Is yes, we know that among us white Christians there are racists, but not me. I've confessed my sins. I've fired all my racist workers. I've stopped supporting them, and I've started supporting the right causes. Most white rich people don't care for the poor, but not me. Most men are oppressors, but not me. And I think that it's the same thing when you justify the sin is when you say, well, I'm not like the rest of them. You know, I'm not, you know, that's what people want to do with Adolf Eichmann. Adolf, you know, anybody named Adolf, I suppose. Adolf Eichmann, Adolf Hitler. We're not like that. You know, yeah, I know we're all sinners, but we're not like that kind of sinner. And that's what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, that it was, that Eichmann was a very ordinary person who just did under certain circumstances what most other people might do, which is keep the trains running on time. And so I think that it's all this idea that we are somehow not as bad as the other people. And so I think the simple idea, and you both have made it, is that how do you qualify to do heinous evil? By being born. Born into this world. In sin did my mother conceive me. Psalm 51. Also, you know, Scott Peck in his book, People of the Lie, he was a psychiatrist, and he said that a woman came up to him at a cocktail party, and she said, you know, I need some help, but don't tell me I need a bunch of therapy or tell me something Freudian. I hope you'll tell me I'm a sinner. And the reason she said that is because if you're a sinner, you know that you can be redeemed and you know you can change. And so you're not stuck with who you are. You're not just a victim, but you're somebody who can really change and be transformed and overcome. And so that's what the message is really about sin, is that when we confess it, as the point you both have been making, and we overcome it, we can overcome it through the power of Christ and through transformation and new birth. So, great discussion. What I want to do now is take another break, listen to all the things that we can do that Steve Simmons orders us to do, and you better do it. And we're going to come back with a very fluffy talk about, we're going to start, what if, here we go. What if we had, instead of sports talk, we had church talk? And so we're going to do that. We're going to talk about who's your most valuable player, who's the most improved player, who's the comeback player of the year, who gets the Lifetime Achievement Award, who's been the biggest disappointment of the year, and sort of like stuff like that, because I find it fascinating. So we're going to try it out, see what you think. Okay, we'll take a break.
If you want to expand the disciple-making movement, then share the show with your friends and colleagues. Hey, it's easy to subscribe. Simply go to iTunes or to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com, then click on The Bonhoeffer Show. Once you do, we will keep you updated with the Bonhoeffer Project's events, new materials and books, as well as the larger disciple-making movement current news. You can also access previous programs. And be sure to read Bill's weekly column, which is posted on the website. Remember, ask questions. Bill's answers are guaranteed to give you herd immunity, increase your IQ, and cause you to experience waves of euphoria. Well, not really, but his answers are really good. And now, let's get back to the Bonhoeffer Show.
Okay, we're back. It's Church Talk with Dan, Cindy, and Bill. All right. Now, to get into this church talk thing, it takes a little bit of, you talk about, I watch a sports program, and what they do is they talk about the there's the play of the day, there's the quote of the day, and people talk about who's going to be the MVP in the NBA this year, who was the MVP in the NFL. I think it was Aaron Rodgers won in the NFL. Comeback player of the year was Alex Smith of the Washington football team. So there are a number of people like that. So what I'd like for us to get our mind around here is this is church talk, and probably we can only talk about people we know, and we'll use our good judgment here. But who would be for 2020, who is our most valuable player? Who is the most valuable player we had in the church in the United States in particular? And so, Dan, I'm gonna let you go first because I told you about this yesterday and you had a little more time to think about it than Cindy.
Yeah, man, but I didn't know I was going to be quizzed on it. So,
well, here we go.
Yeah, the MVP in the church this year. Gosh, I'm going to go on the default answer. I'm going to go back to Sunday school. I'm just say Jesus.
Oh,
I know I'm losing fans right now, I guess. No, but to be honest with you, I want to say discipleship. I really want to say that because what I've seen in the church, and again, it doesn't have to be a person, it can be a thing. I'm making up the rules as I go, by the way. What this pandemic has revealed in this last year is if you're not a disciple of Jesus, you're going to be lost in this world, because what I think is coming for the church in America is more of this sort of isolation. And if you don't have the discipled background, when you are not a disciple of Jesus, you're going to lose out on what it means to be a Christian through a world that is hostile towards you.
Okay. So Dan, who would be your, who's been the most improved player this year?
Man, most improved player, man. Now I'm not in the arena.
I know this is hard. You see, this is hard. It's a new way of thinking. So if we took the church and we made it like sports, then what would these
then at this point, I'd be doing fantasy church leagues. I would at this point have a full fantasy church league, different categories for worship, for theology, for doctrine, disciple making, and all of the like. I would say different guys that are out there that are doing it. Gosh, I'm drawing a blank right now on most improved. I can tell you who I would say is down on that list, but I don't even know if it's too soon to even say it.
Okay, so I'm going to say most valuable player for me is going to be Robbie Gallaty, lead pastor of Long Hollow Baptist Church in Hendersonville, Tennessee, who is a disciple-making pastor par excellence. Plus, not only that, his church has gone through a great resurgence this year. Hundreds and hundreds of people baptized. Yes. So he's seen a real revival and really some great things happen. So I'm going to give MVP to Robbie Gallaty.
Amen. I second.
Okay. Now, how about you, Cindy?
So on a national level, I was thinking the partners in discipleship.org, because I think there are some amazing, and Robbie engages with us in that place. The Bonhoeffer Project is part of that. Alex Absalom is part of that. I think all of the disciple-making leaders that have come together and said, we're in this thing and we're gonna make this a priority in the coming years. And so I think what Bobby Harrington has done with that, but I don't think it's just him in that place. I think it is that discipleship.org consortium. We've come together, all of us doing a little bit different, toward the same goal and moving the kingdom forward. And I think God is pleased with that, because we see the unity of the body across denominations, across parachurch organizations, within churches that are affected. In my personal ministry, I'm going to tell you that the most valuable player showed herself up 2 weekends ago. I met a lady through actually one of the ladies in my cohort in the Bonhoeffer Project. She and her worship leader were planning to start a women's ministry, invited my Carmelita Voice and I to come over and talk to them about how we engage the women's leadership in our church. And so we did that. We went to Oviedo, which is near Orlando. And we shared that with them, got to know them. We were having a retreat a couple of weekends ago and asked Courtney Haley is her name. She's a worship leader extraordinaire, came out of Nashville and the recording scene to follow God's call on her life to lead worship in the local church. Amazingly talented, but beyond that, we had at this retreat, one of our leaders found out that her 21-year-old son had passed that afternoon. And so when we went into that evening session, this woman who had known us for a couple of days stepped in and led us through a worship space that allowed us to grieve and see God's face in an amazing way. And it was just amazing. And so for me, she's the MVP. She is
okay. Great. That's great choice. Great call there. Okay. We only have time for one more. Okay. Lifetime Achievement Award. I have a name in mind. Lifetime Achievement Award this year for a pastor who retired. Now you don't have to. I'll tell you who it is. But now I'll tell you who it is, and then you guys can think about who you're going to give the Lifetime Achievement Award to. Charles Stanley. He retired as pastor of First Baptist Church Atlanta. He's faithfully taught the scriptures on television for 40 years. And Andy Stanley's dad. But so I'm going to give it to Charles Stanley.
Well, I would give it to you, Bill.
Lifetime achievement?
Yeah. Like, you know more about discipleship. You've forgotten more about discipleship than we'll probably ever know. You agree, Dan?
Agreed.
You have been pushing forward the idea of discipleship for longer than my kid's been alive, right? So you've written more books, you continue to beat the drum that says, this is what it has to be. This is what it has to be. And so that tenacity for me, for you to do that for a lifetime and to engage people along the way, because never have I been around you, and you can turn off your video so you're not blushing, but never have I seen you not engage other people and draw them in and bring them in. And that for me says, that is a lifetime achievement award in God's kingdom, moving forward the kingdom. So, well,
I'm greatly humbled.
Couldn't say it better myself, and I agree 100%.
Well, you guys are going to get a free dinner. Okay. All right. So you have anybody else you'd like to pay homage to? Comeback Player of the Year, Johnny Mack. I always wonder what happened to John MacArthur, and man, this year I don't have to ask that anymore. Johnny Mack came back strong. So I guess that's it for today. You see how hard it is to do sports talk, do church talk. It's a lot harder than it looks. So thank you, Dan and Cindy, and ladies and gentlemen, remember, follow Jesus and he'll teach you everything you'll ever need to know.
Well, we hope that the show wasn't too bad. Jane Hull wants everyone to know that if anything Bill said was offensive, she feels your pain. If you were upset by anything Bill and his guests said, well, mission accomplished. At the Bonhoeffer Show, we value irreverent, satirical, and generally inappropriate behavior. But when it comes to fulfilling the Great Commission, we don't mess around. Remember, subscribe. We promise. No private jets, no white suits, and definitely no toupees.